Good afternoon, and welcome to the exhibition opening weekend lecture for On 52nd Street, the Jazz Photography of William P. Gottlieb. I'm Deborah Burke, the Acting Director of Education here at the museum. It's lovely to see you all here this afternoon in a cool place. Our speaker is Frank Goodyear, the co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art in Brunswick, Maine. He was previously a curator of photographs at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, a graduate of Princeton University and the University of Texas at Austin. He's done research in the history of photography, American art history, and the history of the American West. While at the National Portrait Gallery, he curated or co-curated more than a dozen exhibitions. He is the author of numerous scholarly essays and 6 books, including Red Cloud, Photographs of a Lakota Chief, Faces of the Frontier, Photographic Portraits from the American West, 1845 to 1924, A President in Yellowstone, the F.J. Haynes photographic album of Chester Arthur's 1883 expedition, and with Joel Dinerstein, American Cool. His current research project concerns the photographs from Theodore Roosevelt's 1909-1910 scientific expedition to British East Africa. Today, Dr. Goodyear will explore the jazz musicians that William Gottlieb knew and photographed during a pivotal time in the development of that musical form. Please help me welcome Dr. Frank Goodyear.
Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be back in Tulsa. This is a marvelous city that I enjoy visiting very much, and part of what makes this place so special is the Gilcrease Museum. Just a world-class institution whose collections are really unparalleled. I want to especially thank Director Jim Pepper Henry and to Deborah Burke for their hospitality. It's always fun coming to Tulsa. I'm here today to talk about Bill Gottlieb, arguably the most accomplished photographer to chronicle jazz golden age in the 1940s. This exhibition was organized by the Bowdoin College Museum of Art up in Brunswick, Maine, and it's a great honor to have it here in a city in which jazz has been performed and has flourished for almost 100 years. It's really remarkable to look at the history of this musical tradition and to realize that here in the South, the Southwest, that jazz is such an important part of this culture. It's especially neat to have this exhibition on view, for it's the first time ever that vintage prints, prints that were made by Gottlieb himself in the 1940s. It's the first time that these photographs have ever been exhibited. It's interesting to note that Gottlieb made more than 2,000 portraits, photographic portraits of more than 250 different musicians during a 10-year period between around 1938 and 1948. In 1979, the Library of Congress acquired all of Gottlieb's negatives, and if you go online, you can search the Gottlieb collection at the Library of Congress. And there have been reproductions, modern reproductions of these prints that have been made and have circulated and have been published before, but never before have the actual existing prints from the family been brought together and exhibited. And these beautiful prints are here on view and form the core of the show upstairs. I'm coming from faraway Maine, and I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the Bowdoin College Museum of Art here at the outset. It is one of the oldest college art museums in the country. Its founding collections came to the college more than 200 years ago. It's the only museum in the state of Maine whose collections are truly global in scope and transhistorical. We have collections that go back more than 4,000 years. You're seeing the building right here, the original building. The brick building there was designed by Charles McKim of the firm McKim, Mead and White, and opened in 1894. And then a thoughtful renovation and expansion, including a new sort of glass entranceway, opened in 2007 by the Boston architects Mikado and Silvetti. This is a close-up of the McKim Building, and I know it's a little warm outside here. It's lovely in Maine right now, and I welcome you if you ever visit Maine to stop in Brunswick. But I especially recommend the summers for, indeed, several months out of the year, it kind of looks like this. And having endured 11 feet of snow this past winter, I'm not originally from Maine. I'm still kind of getting used to the climate there. Just very quickly, two sort of highlights from the collection. The Assyrian relief that you see on the left, excavated from a site outside of current-day Mosul, Iraq, a royal palace, excavated by a team of British scientists who were working for the British Museum at the time. It just so happens that a Bowdoin grad was doing missionary work in the Middle East at the time, and when they were distributing these 300 wall reliefs, most of them were going to go to the British Museum, but like a good Bowdoin grad, he raised his hand and said, perhaps we could get 5 or 6 of these for Maine. And so these are remarkable examples of ancient Assyrian art at a site that ISIS has recently damaged significantly. And also the great portrait of Thomas Jefferson by Gilbert Stuart, painted in 1805 in the midst of his presidential tenure, a painting that was actually commissioned by James Bowdoin, the founder of the college. So it's kind of neat, some of the highlights. But that said, I'm here to talk about Bill Gottlieb. This is his photograph of 52nd Street. And it might be worth talking a little bit about what is 52nd Street and what is its larger significance to jazz history. Well, beginning in the late 1930s, there grew up about a dozen or so jazz clubs along a 1.5 block section of 52nd Street, basically between 5th Avenue and the sort of middle of 6th and 7th Avenue. There were a whole number of different clubs. You see many of them sort of lit up in neon here, the Three Deuces, the Club Carousel, Jimmy Ryan's, the Onyx. These clubs hosted some of the most significant jazz musicians of the era. It was a crossroads of sorts for different styles of jazz. There's important to realize that jazz has a long and varied history, and so it wasn't simply the beboppers who were on 52nd Street. 52nd Street was also site of the Dixieland Revival and swing, big band swing as well. It was also a place that Dizzy Gillespie later commented was one of the most integrated streets in New York City. he felt very comfortable as an African-American musician performing there. He had less favorable things to say about the rest of New York City, but it was a place where integrated bands, integrated audiences, people from a variety of different backgrounds could come together to enjoy this important music. 52nd Street was certainly not the only place, not only in New York City, but around the country, in which jazz was performed and enjoyed. Certainly down in Greenwich Village, up in Harlem, there were significant jazz venues, but it's really the concentration of these different clubs that made this place really the centerpiece for the jazz world in the United States, especially in the 1940s. Let me tell you a little bit about Bill Gottlieb. We'll see a bunch of his pictures here in a second, but let me give you a little bit of biography just to sort of set the stage here. Bill Gottlieb was born in 1917 in Brooklyn, New York. He became very passionate about jazz as a college student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Upon graduating from Lehigh in the late 1930s, he had an interest in going into the newspaper business. And his first job in the middle of the Depression was working for the advertising department at the Washington Post, where he earned $25 a week selling ads that would appear in the Washington Post. He went to the managing editor one day and said, you know, I'd really like to contribute a weekly jazz column to the Post. And he did so in part because he loved jazz and was going to many of the shows already, but he was also at the time looking to make some additional money as well. And indeed, the managing editor agreed to pay him an extra $10 a week to run this column. Initially, the Washington Post assigned a photographer to accompany him to shows, but it became readily apparent that the Post couldn't afford a distinct photographer. And so Gottlieb was sort of on his own and asked one of his Post friends if he could borrow his camera in order to take photographs at these performances that he was reviewing. His friend said yes, and Gottlieb taught himself how to make photographs. He was working initially with a speed graphic camera, which was a very bulky camera that was favored by photojournalists at this particular time. It's important to realize that Life magazine was founded in 1936, really the first sort of illustrated weekly magazine in which pictures played as strong a part as the text itself. And I think that Gottlieb, who loved Life magazine, came to realize that photography was going to be really important in bringing to life the performers whose work he was chronicling. During World War II, Gottlieb served in the Air Force. He was a staff photographer in the Air Force. And upon leaving the military, he moves to New York and in fact has an office on 51st Street, only a block away from 52nd Street, and was working on assignment for various both jazz magazines like Downbeat and Metronome, but also for magazines with a slightly more general focus and wider circulation like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. Gottlieb's work as a critic and a photographer really only spans about 10 years. And so all the pictures that I'm going to show you here are all done within a period between roughly 1938 and 1948. He quit quite abruptly in 1948, in part because he was newly married with young children, and as he was often out late into the night and into the early morning, I think it became readily apparent that he needed to spend more time with his parents. He spent really the rest of his career working to produce educational film strips, and left behind altogether his work as a jazz photographer. I want to argue in the show and here today that Gottlieb and a handful of other photographers in the late 1930s and 1940s were at the beginning of a revolution in picturing musicians. It's interesting to look at an early photograph of musicians, a daguerreotype made in the 1850s, to sort of give you an idea of what a portrait of a musician might look like. And so here we have two itinerant musicians, one on banjo, one on bones, who have gone into a commercial photographic studio and have had their portrait made. They hold their instruments. They sort of are composed in such a way that they are clearly kind of sort of performing together. But generally speaking, it's a very sort of static picture. They are seated. It's sort of a blank backdrop. There's not a lot of sort of energy and activity. Really, the only way in which we can know that they are musicians is the fact that they hold instruments in their hand. Gottlieb, on the other hand, really worked very hard to foreground his subjects' individuality and their unique style. In his writing, Gottlieb tried to convey something of the personality of musicians, and his photographs were meant to sort of complement this sort of exploration of, what made a musician like Billie Holiday the musician that she was. We're now long accustomed to photographs of rock and roll stars, country music stars, hip hop stars, in which they are mid-performance, pictures of great exuberance and life. Really, that tradition of performance photography did not exist until a photographer like Bill Gottlieb came along and began to sort of rethink the creative possibilities of what a music photograph might look like. And here's just one example. And I think you can see some striking differences between this picture and the one we saw previously. For one thing, look how close he has gotten to the subject. He is literally in Sidney Bechet's lap, looking kind of up at him as he is in sort of mid-performance. I think it's important to note that he is sort of monumentalizing this extraordinary clarinet, soprano sax player. Jazz in the 1940s was America's popular music. It was what households across the socioeconomic, racial spectrum jazz was the music that America listened to in the 1940s, and 52nd Street really became the center of that world, and as I said, a crossroads for different peoples. And so you have an early New Orleans master like Bichette, who's playing sort of traditional sort of Dixieland jazz, who's able to find a warm audience in New York City. Other of the sort of Dixieland jazz musicians who found new life to their careers in New York. This is William Bunk Johnson, also from New Orleans. A photograph of Johnson that was made in the 1946. Johnson had quit playing music for more than a decade for a variety of reasons, and was actually working as a farm laborer down in Louisiana when all of a sudden his contributions were rediscovered by folklorists and historians who were studying the early history of jazz, and his career gets resurrected, and he friends buy him a new trumpet, and all of a sudden he has this sort of second career, much of it again happening in big urban centers like New York City. It's also the case that at the end of his career, he met his new wife, Maud Johnson, in the background. They had been just recently married, and it's interesting about Gottlieb. He spent long hours at these clubs and came to be very sort of close with many of the musicians. They were friends, and many of these musicians permitted Gottlieb the opportunity to portray them both in mid-performance, but also during breaks and behind the scenes. Gottlieb's once remarked, quote, "It's difficult to think of jazz without thinking of Louis Armstrong." A pioneering musician who's perhaps, I think, better known today as sort of the engaging sort of face of jazz, but lost is the fact, I think, that it's Armstrong whose distinct type of playing, the sort of independent improvisations, really revolutionized jazz as a musical form. This is a picture taken in 1947 when Armstrong is playing with his All-Stars. This picture happened to be made at Carnegie Hall in New York at a moment when Armstrong was sort of the highest paid jazz musician in the world. Again, you see how close Gottlieb has gotten to his subject, working with this big, bulky camera with a flash. Gottlieb tended to take only 3 or 4 exposures in the course of a performance. The 1940s was a very different era in photography. Whereas today, with digital photography, we can take 300 pictures in a 10-minute stand. With the kind of camera technology that Gottlieb was using, it was really only possible during a performance to take 2 to 3 to 4 pictures. And that these flashes were really quite bright and distracting. And so Gottlieb, sensitive to being a distraction or an annoyance at these concerts, would oftentimes signal to a musician or a group that he was about to sort of take a picture. And the musician would, in a sense, give him a pose, would say, okay, I'm going to make eye contact with you, and this is your moment to take a picture. And I think a little something of that is happening here. Photographer and subject understood that there was this, that these portraits were the product of an exchange between the subject and photographer. Nat King Cole, one of the great, we know him today as one of the great sort of singers of this era. Also, of course, an incredible player, a piano player. And to sort of see Gottlieb literally on the stage with the performers. Again, today, when we talk about photographing musicians, there are so many layers of sort of security around our performers that, you and I, we can't get even close to them. And that managers so carefully cultivate a particular persona for a musician. Compare it with this era when Gottlieb could literally get on stage with these performers, creating pictures for that would complement his writing. You'll see in so many of the pictures that they are vertical format. And this is largely because his column tended to be one column in sort of length, and the photograph had to literally sort of fit within that one column. And so to create a kind of horizontal format picture would have been a challenge to those who were sort of laying out the picture. I think it's also important as we look at this picture of Cole to mention that jazz musicians really were pioneers in the campaign for racial equality at this time period, and that 52nd Street became a place in order to, a place to break new ground in terms of the role that African Americans could play in public life. Nat King Cole, the first African American to host his own television variety show, and so many of the people who are in this exhibition were pioneers in this larger campaign. Love these two pictures of Billie Holiday, taken in 1946, a time period when Metronome magazine named her the most popular jazz musician in the country. Two wonderful pictures that convey different things about her. The picture on the left, as Gottlieb himself said, he loved that picture because not only did it convey something of the beauty of her voice, but something also about the anguish that was also so much a part of her performances and her life more generally. It's a beautiful picture. It's now become kind of an iconic representation of Billie Holiday because the Library of Congress has permitted the reproduction from their original negative. But the photograph of Holiday that you see upstairs, it's the original vintage print, and there's only one of them. And so it's kind of neat to see the Gottlieb print that began it all. And then the picture on the right, which shows her backstage at the club downtown on 52nd Street, where she sits in her dressing room with her boxer dog named Mister, two gardenias in her hair, a pineapple. And I love this photograph because Gottlieb, as a photographer, he's always sort of experimenting with how to sort of portray subjects. No two of these portraits are ever really the same. Even though they're all portraits, many of them are in a vertical format, he's always doing different things, whether looking up at a subject, lighting the subject in different ways, including different kinds of background. But here, photographing Holiday as reflection in this dressing room mirror conveyed a much more sort of relaxed persona. And he was able to achieve this because he was on had such a close relationship with so many of these musicians. They trusted him to only publish, pictures that conveyed them in a really kind of positive light. This show has many of the most famous iconic figures of 1940s jazz, but there's also a number of the lesser known figures, sidemen in larger bands or orchestras, or figures who were once popular but who we don't necessarily remember today. Dardanelle is one, a great vibraphone player from Mississippi. It's interesting, though 52nd Street was an integrated place, and African American musicians were well received, and integrated bands were generally well received. It is the case that female musicians had a hard time of it. You won't see that many portraits of female musicians, though of course there were a significant number of female singers, and many who played specific instruments like Dardanelle. Women had a much harder time on 52nd Street, which was tended to be a rather sort of male-dominated place. Love this photograph of Huddie Ledbetter, the famous blues musician who folklorist John Lomax, quote, discovered in a Louisiana prison where he had been jailed for attempted homicide. A blues musician who became remarkably sort of mainstream and popular in the 1940s. It's an interesting portrait of Leadbelly, the way in which, especially in regards to the lighting of the photograph. Gottlieb has deliberately manipulated the flashes effect in order to produce, as he said at the time, a kind of sinister portrait, that he was trying to somehow convey something of his background as somebody who had run afoul of the law in an earlier life. And he later regretted, Gottlieb later regretted that he portrayed Leadbelly in this fashion, for he actually found him in person to be, as Gottlieb said, a mild, even gentle person, whose music was extraordinarily powerful and whose commitment to various left-wing causes was consistent with Gottlieb's own views. But it's a haunting portrait for sure. Again, thinking about Gottlieb's experimentation, this double exposure of the drummer Ray McKinley came about because Gottlieb found McKinley to be rather cold in person and unwilling to convey something of his personality and his playing style. And so he had the occasion of seeing McKinley perform against this kind of dark backdrop and thought to himself, what better way to portray a drummer and the sort of energetic work that a drummer does than a double exposure, in which we sort of see the action of his hand. There are many modernist photographers in the 1930s and 40s who are looking to explore the kind of creative possibilities of photography as a medium. And though Gottlieb was not part of the artistic avant-garde, I think he was really groundbreaking for how he approached his subjects and the creativity that he displayed in terms of new ways of picturing these musicians. Gottlieb also had a nice sense of humor. He got along easily with people. And there's, I think, a little bit of sense of humor in this picture of three musicians who worked as sidemen for Duke Ellington. Gottlieb, as I mentioned, he was good friends with many musicians. He spent long hours on 52nd Street, and he was able to get these kinds of humorous shots because he was back scenes and behind the scenes, and he hung out between sets, and he was recognized as a friend. Jazz, of course, is also increasingly popular abroad as well. One of the first great European jazz musician was the guitarist Django Reinhardt. Born in Belgium, raised in France, his hand was burned in a fire as a young boy, and yet having learned of jazz and being captivated by its beauty, he dedicated himself to carving out a career as a jazz guitarist. And Gottlieb didn't ignore the fact that he had been, that his hand had been damaged as a child. For, as you see to the right, you see something of that damaged hand, which had paralyzed two of his fingers. And again, in Gottlieb's writing about Reinhardt, he talks about Reinhardt's sort of dedication to his art and sort of overcoming these sort of physical handicaps. Reinhardt comes to the United States in 1946 to perform with Duke Ellington on a larger tour, which included a stop on 52nd Street when, in fact, this picture was made. I should say, as a quick aside, when you go through the exhibition itself, you're going to see a number of people that you would expect to see, but there are also going to be some folks that are missing. You're going to wonder, where's Duke Ellington? Where's Charlie Parker? Where's Lester Young? Gottlieb took photographs of all of these individuals. In fact, he took photographs of them on multiple occasions, and they're all in the Library of Congress archive. And yet, regrettably, vintage prints don't survive of these particular shots. And we made the decision in putting the exhibition together to really just foreground the original vintage prints. And so you'll pardon us for some conspicuous gaps in the lineup. A couple more pictures here. Charles Delaney was a writer from France. Shows him outside a club on 52nd Street. Gottlieb was interested not only in those who performed jazz, but also those who were in that world as writers, as managers, what have you. Charles Delaney wrote one of the earliest histories of jazz. He also published a leading jazz magazine in Europe at the time. And he compiled Hot Discography in 1938, the first comprehensive listing of known jazz recordings. He's a really important figure in this moment in jazz's history. For those art historians in our midst. He's the son of artists Robert and Sonia Delaney, important modernist painters in France at this time period. And while he spent much of his career in Paris, he liked nothing more than to get to New York and get to 52nd Street. The great guitarist Eddie Condon, as well known for the club that he had on the corner of 52nd Street and 6th Avenue as he was a guitarist. Condon was the leader of a racially integrated band that got him into trouble from time to time. In 1946, the year in which this picture was made, Condon and his orchestra were barred from playing Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall for his music, as the Washington Post wrote, might stimulate the emotions of bobby sockers to the point that they lose their equilibrium. And like Marian Anderson 7 years earlier, who was barred from Constitution Hall, so too did Condon, and his racially integrated band have difficulty playing in Washington. Ultimately, on that occasion, he plays at the Willard Hotel to a capacity audience. Wonderful picture of Condon at his club. Hawk or Bean, Coleman Hawkins, one of the great tenor saxophone players from outside of Kansas City, grew up here in the Midwest, began playing publicly at the age of 12, a star soloist in Fletcher Henderson's orchestra before leaving the United States to play abroad for 5 years. Really important soloist who anticipates the transition from sort of big band swing to bebop at this era, and certainly one of Gottlieb's favorites. Earl Father Hines, similar to Hawkins, Hines had a long and distinguished career as a piano player. In fact, helped to sort of revolutionize jazz piano. Had played in earlier sort of big band orchestras, but becomes famous in this period in the 1940s for his improvisations on the piano. And really the most visible face of bebop in the 1940s, with his trademark goatee, beret, thick-rimmed glasses. Dizzy Gillespie is the face of this new sort of modern form of jazz that became known as bebop. And an interesting picture here, again, created for publication. And so you have to sort of imagine that this would have been inserted within a page of text, and where he's cut out a picture of Gillespie and then pasted it on top of a piece of paper in which he's written bebop over and over again, and then rephotographed it. This kind of montage that, again, celebrates Gillespie's role as the sort of leader of this new musical tradition. A photograph that was published in Downbeat in 1947. As I said, it was Gillespie, known for his sort of flamboyant showmanship, but also his cool, the way in which he was able to navigate the relationship with audiences, that he was able to sort of confront the racism that oftentimes he endured by different kinds of sort of public poses. And what I love about these photographs is that while many of these musicians had to kind of negotiate a relationship with the audiences and with the public. Gottlieb, because the trust that musicians had in him, they're able to sort of let down their guard and reveal something of their true selves. And the last picture I want to show you this afternoon, the picture of the drummer Dave Tuff, who again may not be a household name, but this is the photograph that William Gottlieb liked the most of all of the pictures that he took in his career. And you might ask why. Well, this picture shows Tuff in the basement of a 52nd Street club on a break between sets, practicing on his drum pad. He's got a smoke in his mouth. He's got a glass of wine there on his side. And Gottlieb really liked Tuff, for he felt as though he was the sort of consummate professional who was always sort of practicing at his art. This dedication to one's art was something that he really admired in so many of these musicians. Many drummers during this period, players like Gene Krupa or Buddy Rich, had a certain flamboyant showmanship, like to kind of like to show off and call attention to themselves. That wasn't Tuff, but Tuff was, I think, simply a great musician who loved his craft. And I think in many respects, that's also true of Bill Gottlieb himself, a consummate professional who loved his craft, who loved what he was doing. Gottlieb wasn't the only photographer to chronicle the jazz world in this period. Photographers like Herman Leonard, John Mealy, Charles Peterson are other important chroniclers. But during this period, nobody took more photographs or more revealing photographs of the New York jazz scene. And that this work, I think, really does anticipate much of sort of music photography that will follow. And so it's a joy to bring this work here to Tulsa, and I hope you enjoy the show. I'm happy to go up to the galleries afterwards and look at the show with you all together, but we have time for a question or two if there are any. Happy to entertain any questions. Yeah, thank you.
I'll make a comment. I met Bill Gottlieb in about 1990, roughly, and at a jazz party in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Uh-huh.
And we lived in Bartlesville at the time and had presented a show at their museum there of Gottlieb pictures, but they were, as you said, they were reproductions, not apparently not
The original vintage prints, right?
And I had done a little interview about it since I was interested in jazz and photography, and sent him a copy of that interview. And he sent me back an autographed, or he signed, I should say autographed, he signed a picture of the Billie Holiday photo.
Nice. Very nice.
Nice guy, met him for, talked to him 5 minutes, I guess, that's all.
The really wonderful thing about Bill Gottlieb is he's a very generous soul. You know, sitting on these 2,000 negatives at the end of his life, you know, he could have probably gone out and made all these sort of modern prints and marketed these pictures through the roof. But I think the much more sort of elegant response to what to do with those pictures was to present them to the nation, to give them to the Library of Congress, where they have all now been digitized. They're all readily accessible. They can be downloaded and used in PowerPoints such as this or in classrooms. I think he understood that he was witness to a very special moment in music history, and he wasn't necessarily looking to profit off of it. He was looking to share it with the larger public. Seems like a good guy. I never met him, but I've heard only good things. Yes?
I'm curious, he never changed from it. When he started out in 1938, he used a 4x5 speed graphic. He never changed from
Yeah, he used a couple of other, he started with the speed graphic, but as you probably know, a big camera, and literally holding the camera was work, and it certainly called attention to itself. And so as sort of modern single reflex cameras were introduced in the 1940s, he did move to other kinds of cameras, but he understood that the 4x5 created a really nice negative with a lot of visual information, a lot of sort of subtlety and tonality, and he always loved the speed graphic the most because it really produced the kind of pictures that he was aspiring to take. Yes?
What did the musicians think of the photographers stepping into their environment? Were they welcomed into it, or were the musicians hesitant in any way, or
I think it differed from performer to performer, but I think that many came to see that Gottlieb was serious about what he was doing, that he had a tremendous amount of respect and knowledge about what they were doing, and that Gottlieb built up a level of trust and a reputation as a fair-minded guy. And so there were musicians who were hesitant to be photographed, but they thought in Gottlieb's case that this was somebody whose pictures were not demeaning, were not caricatures, but revealed something of their real personalities. And I think that many photographers came to see that these pictures helped them greatly, literally to raise their visibility among sort of national, indeed even international audiences, and came to sort of realize that being photographed was increasingly a part of the job. Yes?
Tell us a little more about 52nd Street, the history, and what's happening there now.
Yeah. Back in this period, these are a block of brownstones. During Prohibition, there are a number of speakeasies, bars that had grown up along this street. And in the 1930s, after Prohibition, the jazz community starts to kind of have some critical mass on 52nd Street, and really by World War II, you see the sort of full-blown 52nd Street. But what's really sort of sad is that while American audiences loved big band swing, bebop was not as popular among the kind of general public, and while really important new art form within jazz, bebop wasn't drawing the large audiences that big band swing had. And so by the early 1950s, many of these clubs are folding, or they're kind of going in new directions. 52nd Street now is all super skyscrapers as developers, especially sort of in connection with nearby Rockefeller Center, increasingly bought these properties and erected these new towering skyscrapers there in Midtown. Although it is the case that the Museum of Modern Art is one block north of all these places. Listen, thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. I'll see you up in the galleries. Thank you.